Okay, this is Delphina Bailey Nichols, and this is night 3 in my video series called 8 Nights of Feminist Passover. Okay, so tonight for the third night, we are going to talk about, I'm going to cover the deliverance of Devorah, also known as Deborah. And so I'm going to start out first with, according to my studies, Devorah was the fourth judge of Israel, the same way that Zipporah and her husband Moses were the fourth generation born from Abraham, the fourth generation of prophecy that would return to Israel after slavery. Okay. So here we can kind of see a recurring pattern here with how the number 4 is used in these stories. We have the fourth generation, they return to the promised land. They live out the prophecy of becoming slaves. That's Zipporah's generation. Now we come to the deliverance of Devorah, and she is the fourth judge after Moses. She is the only female prophetess to serve as a divine judge, and to basically sit in the seat of Moses as one of his successors, in divine and political authority. And when she takes the reins as a prophetess and a divine judge, the tribes of Israel are pretty much scattered. There's a lot of chaos in abandoned villages. And you see that in the book of Judges, chapter 5, where in the Song of Devorah, she says, before she rose up as a mother, there were abandoned villages and there was chaos in Israel. So she united her people when she rose up as a mother and began her tenure as a prophetess and a divine judge. Now, so we have this continuing pattern of 4, the fourth generation born from Abraham to return from slavery, fulfilling prophecies, Moses and Zipporah. Then you have Deborah, the fourth divine judge, and also the only female divine judge in all of history up to this point. Okay, so before I get into her tenure as divine judge, let's first take a look at why she was a divine judge and why there were no kings before her and also no kings for a long time after her. Let's take a look at that. Now, to understand why there were no kings over Israel for a long time before her and no kings for a long time after, we're going to have to look ahead to the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 8, to understand why the government of Israel was that way, why she and others were divine judges, but with her the only female, of course. Okay, so in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 5 through 9, it says, this is the people of Israel talking to Samuel. I'm just gonna summarize this instead of reading it word for word. But in verses 5 through 9 in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people of Israel are saying, "You're old. Your sons are not like you and not following in your ways. Give us a king so we can have a king like all these other nations." Because during this time, they're not seeing the miracles that older generations used to see. And, hearing the word of God is not a common thing to them. So, they're saying, hey, well, we need a king to compensate for this. And, in reply, in verse 7, You know, God says to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. And then in verses 8 through 9, God goes on to tell Samuel, according to all the works which they have done since the day I brought them up out of Egypt unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods, and so they do the same to you. Now therefore listen to their voice, and show them the manner of the king that will reign over them. And then in verse 18 he says, Samuel, he tells the people what type of king will reign over them, and explains to them what a king does and how they're not going to like it. And then in verse 18, Samuel tells the people, and you will cry out in that day because of your king, which you will have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. So right there, he's saying, okay, well, you want a king instead of divine judges. You want a king to reign over you and not me. So he's basically telling the people of Israel, that's why you don't see the level of miracles that the older generation used to see. That's why you don't have deliverance on the level they used to. You rejected me. You don't listen. You don't want to change. And this king that you've chosen to reign over you, when you cry out to me because of him, I will not answer you. Right there, verse 18. So when you hear people, especially people from West African religions, saying, oh, God is passive, oh, God doesn't do anything, oh, God doesn't want to hear us. No, that's not true. It's not true, because with the attitude of the Elohim above all the others, his attitude is, hey, if you're going to ignore me, you don't want to hear anything I have to say, you don't respect me, you don't want to repent and change, and you want a king to reign over you and not me through my divine judges, okay, fine. His attitude is, I'll give you what you want. But when you cry out to me because of your kings, no, I won't answer you. When you got to go, so we can clearly see that the choice and the free will of the people, they chose to be left alone and abandoned to a much greater extent. They directly chose that for themselves. And when you do that, you can't go back and say, well, why didn't you do this? Well, why didn't you do that? It doesn't work that way. It don't work that way. You can't just disrespect, slander, and disregard a higher being and say, I don't want to hear nothing you want to say. I ain't going to do nothing you want to do. And then turn around and say, but why did you let this happen? Why do you let that happen? Like the Most High, the Elohim above Elohim, he's not a slave. He's not a slave. He, like the angels, they're not your slaves. They don't have to take slander and disrespect and unwillingness to change. They don't have to take a whole lot of shit off of you and then still do what you want on a higher level. They don't have to. They have a choice too, just like you do. They got to do shit they don't want to do. People might have to take a lot of shit off of you with a smile. People might have to take shit off of you every day and pretend like everything's okay. But the angels and the Elohim above Elohim, the kingdom of heaven, they're not obligated to do that. They don't have to if they don't want to. So right here, we can clearly see why there were divine judges, and why there was no king for a long time. And we can see what the people of Israel gained for themselves by saying, no, we don't want God ruling us through these divine judges. Give us a king. Okay, well, they took a loss, they took a hit behind doing that. So, we can see what is in the book of Samuel, we can see what Israel lost by departing from the form of government that existed under Moses, and also Deborah, the fourth and only female divine judge. And all the other divine judges, we can see what they lost by letting go of that. Now, getting into Deborah's tenure as the fourth and only female divine judge, we're gonna take a look at how it relates to Yeshua, the coming Messiah who has not been prophesied of yet and who has not been born yet. Okay, so in Deborah's story, in her story in the book of Judges, chapter 5, verse 10, it seems to imply that it was a tradition for divine judges to ride on a white donkey. And it's not that far-fetched, because even today, a lot of the people who live in that part of the world, they have donkeys who serve them in their businesses and on their farms, in their villages. But a lot of people have donkeys in that part of the world. They still do today. So it's not that far-fetched where, so it very well could have been a tradition for divine judges to ride a white donkey, like it seems to imply in the book of Judges, chapter 5, verse 10. Now, when you fast forward, going through the histories, going through hundreds of years, so far as I'm aware of, after Deborah, there's no other divine judge who rides a white donkey, so far as I can tell, until Yeshua is crucified. And during the Passover, when Yeshua does the Last Supper, which is the Passover Seder, and Yeshua, he's going in to get crucified. He enters the city of that, on that Passover, he enters the city riding a white donkey. So with him going into the Last Supper, which is the Passover Seder meal, and to remember the previous deliverances of his people, he goes in riding a white donkey. He's actually carrying out a tradition from the time of Deborah, where divine judges rode a white donkey. And of course, nothing is said about that in the New Testament. In the New Testament, nothing points back to Deborah's time, because at that point, Israel had been exiled multiple times. There was a lot of things lost. It's very possible that nobody really had any memory of those kind of things remaining. But Yeshua, he retained the memory of those older times, and he rode into his Passover dinner and his crucifixion on a white donkey like the divine judges before him. But the catch is that he didn't do any judging while he was physically alive, beyond overturning the tables of the money changers. He saved the bulk of his judgment for after his crucifixion and after his ascension. So that's the difference. Where the other divine judges on the white donkeys judged while they were alive, Yeshua, he was crucified, died, and rose again before entering into the judgment part of his ministry. There's a connection to the ministry of Yeshua, and we can see that here in the story of Deborah in the book of Judges, chapter 5, verse 10. So this verse may also be proof that Yeshua was not Dionysus. It's very possible that this is proof that not only was he not Dionysus, he also was not an incarnation of Dionysus. He's not the god of sex, alcohol, drugs, violence, and madness. No, it's not that. It's something different. And, so in the story of Deborah, what's also unique about her story is she was a leader in her own right. She wasn't attached. She had her own husband separate from the king who she served. And with having a husband separate from the king who she served, that may have given her so much more peace in her life, a level of peace that Zipporah and Sarai never had as the wives of leaders, as you can clearly see if you watched my previous videos. So the separation between church and state, not only did it contribute to Deborah's peace of mind, but on top of that, she lived on a mountaintop. She didn't live in a big community crowded over with people. She lived a little bit separate from everybody on a mountaintop. And if they wanted to hear anything from her, they had to come all the way up the mountain and hear her speak underneath her palm tree. So she was not going out to a lot of different people. If they wanted to hear anything, they had to come to her, and they had to work pretty hard to come to her. They had to climb a whole mountain to reach her palm tree, where she did most of her prophesying. And, so that distance, that separation, that really, I believe, probably contributed a lot to her social safety and emotional health as a woman, not being attached to a king. And having her own separate husband and her own separate home and separate space away from all that stuff, that was good for her. So she was not a general. She was not a commander. She was a teacher, a prophet. She was a source of inspiration. She was a mother. And the first mother in this, in these deliverances, to actually have more peace and not having other females beating her over the head with drama and slander and bullying the kids and all that. And let's see what else we got here. So in the book of Judges, chapter 4, verses 4 through 5, it talks about how she sat under her palm tree on Mount Ephraim, on a mountain, where the Israelites went up to her, seeking her judgments, seeking her help with sorting out the more difficult cases, and she was able to unify her people who were in chaos, disarray, and doing a lot of the wrong stuff and not seeing the level of miracles that the older generation saw because of their behavior, because of their rejection. And let me see. And I think it's also interesting to note that the battle in Deborah's time, hold on, I need to pull this back up here. I lost the page. There's just one more thing in Deborah's story that's connected to prophecy of Yeshua as well, because again, at her point in time, there was no prophecy about Yeshua yet during her time. So not only do we have the practice of prophets riding on a white donkey in her story, just like Yeshua is the only one for hundreds of years to ride on a white donkey like in her day. And also in her time, in Judges 5, verse 19, it says, all the kings of Canaan and in Tanakh, it says, all the kings gathered and fought by the waters of Megiddo, and they took no gain of money. So right here we have not only the white donkey symbolism, but we have the first battle of Armageddon, in the first battle by the waters of Megiddo, in the valley of Megiddo. So just like in the end times, you had the Messiah to ride on a white donkey to the crucifixion. I believe end times prophecy also says something about a second battle of Megiddo as well, where all the kings gather by the waters of Megiddo to battle. So the end times battle of Armageddon, that's not the first one. The first one is actually the one in Deborah's time in Judges 5, verse 19. So in Deborah's story, there's like a clear connection to the future. When you look at what's happening in her day, it mirrors a lot of what happens in Yeshua's time. But there's also like a reversal or a mirroring of sorts going on, because in Deborah's time, you had the divine judges riding on a white donkey, and you have her, the female divine judge, and in her time, the enemy is pierced with a nail, and the nation of Israel goes free, and the nation of Israel wins the battle of Megiddo, the first one. But then in the future, hundreds of years later, where you have the Mashiach, the Messiah, the riding a donkey, which could have possibly been white, as a divine judge. And of course, nobody noticed that because they didn't have the traditions retained. But when you have him coming along riding a white donkey, with his story, it's the opposite from Deborah's. In his story, instead of the enemy being pierced with a nail, it's him who gets pierced by a nail, pierced by his own people, because he's not a freedom fighter like the man who was labeled a murderer and spared from crucifixion. Yeshua was not a freedom fighter like the so-called murderer who was released and exempted from being crucified. So in Deborah's time, you have her on a white donkey, and they win the battle of Armageddon. They pierce the enemy with a nail. They go free. In Yeshua's time, you have him riding a white donkey, calling his people to better themselves or see zero liberation, pretty much. And the enemy does not get pierced. He gets pierced, and his people, they remain in captivity to the Romans. They stay in captivity to the Romans. They are not released. And then 70 years after the crucifixion, all those people who begged for the enemy to pierce his body with the nail, nails. 70 years after that, all the people who begged for that, their children and their grandchildren, got mass murdered in the rebellion of Masada. And it's significant that the mass murder of those people's children and grandchildren happened 70 years later. And here's why it's significant. Okay, Yeshua said, I say unto you that no sign will be given to this wicked generation. Okay. Now, if you remember from the book of Exodus, if you remember from my previous video about the deliverance of Zipporah, scriptures clearly shows that one generation is equal to 100 years. So right there, Yeshua was saying that they would receive no sign for 100 years because their generation is wicked. And within that 100 years of him saying it, not only did they receive no sign, they also got mass murdered at the Battle of Masada, the Masada Rebellion. And that's the part that's not in the Bible because it happens after the crucifixion, but within the time span Yeshua was talking about. Because when he said this wicked generation, he was talking about everybody alive at that time, but going forward 100 years. Because remember, the 4 generations from Abraham, that's the 400 years of enslaved descendants who would eventually return to Israel. And the Masada Rebellion genocide, that was actually a very real thing. And what's happened recently is that some archaeologists discovered a stash of hidden seeds that no one had ever noticed before. And the seeds that were hidden at the Masada fortress where all those Jewish people died, a lot of those seeds are from plants that were fully extinct and that didn't even exist anymore. So what they did was they found a couple of seeds from a very famous type of palm tree that the Romans had killed off to the point of extinction, okay? And they put the seeds of that palm tree inside of a bottle warmer, and they were actually able to sprout some of the seeds. And for this particular type of famous date palm from Jerusalem, some of the trees have the male gender and some have female. And most of the seeds produced trees that had male gender, and there were only 2 females. So now that this palm tree that was intentionally murdered off to the point of extinction is being resurrected from that secret seed stash in at the Masada fortress. You know, now they're getting a new wind, a second life from the 2 females and the several males that have been revived from seeds that have been sitting dormant for like almost 3,000 years. So anyway, I guess that's all I have to say about the tenure of Devorah as the 4th divine judge and how it relates to the future Israel's future rejection of that form of government and how it caused them to reject higher level miracles to deliver them and guide them. And, and also how her tenure as a divine judge is also connected to Yeshua, where in her time, the enemy is pierced with a nail and Israel goes into freedom during her time of divine judges riding on a white donkey. But then we see Yeshua, who comes along hundreds of years later, following her example, riding into the Passover Seder and crucifixion on a white donkey. But there's no liberation for Israel. We see the exact opposite. Instead of the king of the enemy getting pierced with nails, it's the divine judge getting pierced with nails and the people begging for it. It's like everything coming full circle with the continuous pattern of rejections and with the people turning around saying, well, why didn't you do this? Well, why didn't you do that? And so I guess that concludes this segment.